Thank you, Emma and Robot Lady. So, as Emma has just let us know, has just sort of kindly introduced, the presentation hopefully will give you a nice basic overview to managing certain key types of land to maximize their wildlife, including sort of elements to understanding your site before you start, key considerations when doing management, and helpful habitat features to include. We also do have a lot of additional advice available on the Avon Wildlife Trust website, and there's a wealth of information on other sort of trusted resources. So I'll touch on some key resources at the end. So this first sort of bit is just going to go over what the condition of our sort of the general condition of our natural spaces is at the moment, and why we need to manage spaces for nature. So obviously nature reserves are sort of our archetypal preservationist sort of area that we set aside as a sacred space for nature to thrive. And nature reserves are fantastic refuges for many plants and animals, but for wildlife to truly recover and thrive, every possible space must be used to help it. So that includes things like urban parks, farms, even roadside verges and golf courses. We can manage our land to make it more wildlife friendly and create a network of green spaces that gives wildlife the freedom to move between those rural and urban spaces through local parks, nature reserves, and your own back garden. So here on the screen, you can see our Avon Wildlife Trust Nature Recovery Network, this sort of lovely illustration to really accentuate where we see our local nature recovery happening. So this is how we lead our projects, by helping both urban residents connect their gardens together or take action in their local parks, to create sort of wildlife friendly stepping stones, which in turn helps wildlife corridors, linking with nature reserves and other maybe more rural sites conservation. And we're working at the regional scale with local authorities to also create community nature reserves, which I did touch on last week, and we've got a really lovely resource on our website about. We're also helping farmers to understand nature-based solutions for their land, and we're working with individuals who want to take action for nature through advice and community organising projects. But I guess I wanted to start by talking about why we need to sort of intervene with our wild spaces, with our natural spaces. So in the UK, unfortunately, our natural spaces are at this point quite far from natural, sort of from that truly unmanaged, pristine state that's still present in other areas of the world. We've managed our food production for millennia, around 6,000 years to be exact, since we introduced agriculture to the UK. And removing unwanted species was quite an important part of that. So we removed unwanted species like wolves and lynxes and wildcats. We cleared woodland so that we had more space for cattle and crops. We drained our wetlands so they were more suitable for arable farming. And we straightened our rivers and built canals to help us with industry. But all of this did happen relatively slowly. So for the longest of that period, about 5,500 years, we were really just subsistence farmers with relatively small, free-roaming herds, organic crops and small harvests. But over these thousands of years, we worked with the natural nutrient cycles of the land, with seasons and with sort of natural sacrifices of not having those high yields. But wildflowers did eventually domesticate to our meadow management, and scrubland was managed by domestic animals that sort of replaced those wild deer and cattle that fed off it before them. We coppiced our woodlands, which I'll touch on in a moment, and this created more variety in the light levels in our woodlands for our birds and mammals to exploit. But overall, over that sort of 5,500 years, the overall result really was mass deforestation, specifically in the UK. We flattened the landscape a lot more, and we created fragments of unaffected habitats, those priority habitats we talked about before, or that you might see in a triple SI, of really beautiful examples of those more pristine environments that are not widespread in our country anymore. But fundamentally, all of these adaptations was done at a slow pace, and for the most part, wildlife adapted until we really mechanized, and that happened very quickly, from the sort of turn of the century cattle and plough to that sort of really intensive agriculture. So this management has become more extreme in years since the third agricultural revolution, which is also called the Green Revolution, which I find quite ironic for the like relatively miserable slide that's coming up, but I promise it's the only miserable slide, and then we move on to nice things. But yeah, the Green Revolution was really a period of agricultural innovation that massively increased crop yields worldwide from the 40s to the 80s of the last century. And this revolution was driven by new technologies that included crossbreeding, so that development of new crops that could survive in areas or through seasons that they couldn't previously. Agrochemicals, so that might be fertilizers or pesticides, herbicides, all of these different chemicals that we add to the land to increase our yields. Irrigation was a big part of that, allowing us again to utilize land that was previously thought of as unproductive. And also mechanization of farming meant that we could produce so much more and harvest it so much quicker. And yeah, the intensification of agriculture really caused our fields to become bigger with less crop diversity. There was less of a need for fallow years and less reliance on wild pollination, truly wild pollination. Hedges were removed or overmanaged, and this reduced how many flowers could bloom and turn into berries. We artificially fertilized our soils with powders or concentrated manures instead of allowing the vegetables to only grow to the capacity of the soil. Cows and pigs were moved into barns as chickens as well, as you can see. And that allowed them to be kept at much higher capacities, and they were fed grain rather than grass. So you're able to sort of load the land up with far more livestock than it could previously have sustained. On top of that, weed killers were applied to remove nuisance wildflowers in favor of more crop coverage, removing valuable pollen sources for insects from a huge swathe of the countryside. But unfortunately, the soils became saturated, and as you may be familiar with the current state of our waterways, those excess nutrients flowed into our streams and rivers through rain, which causes massive algal blooms that continue to cause mass die-offs to this day. We also, on top of all of that, sprayed pesticides to control slugs and weevils, which were then eaten by hedgehogs and birds, which poisoned them too. And bees that visited these treated crops would carry polluted pollen back to their hives, causing colony collapse. So, like I said, that's a really miserable slide, and we clearly got it wrong. We got it very wrong because we were only looking at increased yields and lower prices and not at the overall quality of our wild habitats. But I promise that was the only really horrible one, and things did get very bad. But luckily, our farmers and our scientists noticed these issues, and slowly we're seeing these issues being acted on at the local and government level. In the grand scheme of things as well, it's important to remember that this was a relatively short period of time, and we've had the chance now to make amends for these issues. And this presentation is about positive land management and essentially trying to reverse these trends and create these habitats that are good for nature, which is also why we're really focusing a lot of what I'd call what are called traditional land management techniques that are really that pre-agricultural revolution, like pre-industrialization methodologies. So just to bring it back to our nature recovery networks, for context, the bright side is in the UK, there are 23 million gardens covering just under 500,000 hectares of land. And there's also around 27,000 parks. So in the urban level, these urban areas are really important reservoirs for so many species. Today, I even learned in the wildlife symposium that Emma and I attended. Oh, sorry, Emma, you didn't make it, but I attended it. So here's a fact for you. Almost 50% of available suitable habitats for bats are found in private gardens. So, these private spaces, they may feel sort of small in stature compared to these large farms, but they really, when added together, make a massive impactful difference. And just to highlight, the value of those domestic green spaces, like we said at the beginning, it's all about connectivity and making sure that wildlife isn't restricted to the reserves that it exists on or the rural countryside, and that there's a lot more connectivity between all of those spaces. Another consideration is that those common species that we think of maybe as not particularly conservation important are still really vital for food web health. Without invertebrates like slugs and flies and bees and caterpillars, we lose these larger animals higher up in the food chain, that sort of middle tier of small mammals and amphibians, which are really important food sources for the sort of apex predators we currently have, like foxes, badgers, and those sorts of carnivorous birds. So thinking on that whole food web scale is really useful. So I've included all of this just because it's really important to understand why we use traditional techniques to manage land and why we're moving more away from sort of convenient options, which you might sort of think at the end of this, well, all of that sounds like a bloody lot of work, but nothing's in a rush. None of it's in a rush. And doing things slowly is also really beneficial for wildlife, doing things slowly over time, allowing for the habitats to adapt, not removing all of the food source for certain species that may rely on it. And yeah, we're going to go over the key considerations for understanding what your site may need and what techniques may be suitable for managing it. So for each of these habitats we're going to go over hedgerows, woodlands and grasslands, and I'm going to really quickly touch on water bodies, but water bodies are their own kettle of fish. So we'll do that. We'll go over that another time. But when managing a site for wildlife, it's really important to know what kinds of habitats and species are already there. And you don't need to be an ecologist to be able to read a habitat for key ecological signs. So looking at the photos on the right, if it's your typical garden, the habitats may consist of grassland, maybe amenity grassland with only one or two plant species, maybe a ryegrass turf and some white clover or daisies. There may be some shrubs, some ornamental shrubs like camellias, or maybe more native plants like dog rose or guelder rose, and maybe some single species hedging like cherry laurel or evergreen conifers, and maybe even a couple trees. If maybe you have a bit more of a wildlife friendly space, you may also have a pond habitat or an area of deadwood or some hibernation boxes. And you might have some wildflowers in your lawn. And in that space, you'll probably have foxes visiting, you'll have common garden bird species, and invertebrates visiting or residing in the space. When we look at a local park, we see much of the same. Hedges might tend to lean more towards native species, and they might be a bit more diverse. There might be areas that are mown slightly less often, and that's just the benefits that afford of having such a bigger space to work with. And then, yeah, when we look at those larger and often more rural sites, places like our designated areas, for example, local wildlife sites or SSIs, we'll see more of those specialist priority habitats like traditional orchards, maybe beech woodlands, or if you're up somewhere towards Clevedon, maybe lowland bog, just to name a few. But we're also more likely to encounter species of regional or maybe even international importance. And it's those species of in principal importance or European protected species that we talked about last week that will already have agreed management plans set out by the responsible governing body. So I'll touch on it in a moment. But if you're dealing with priority habitats or designated sites, it's really important to make sure that you've consulted the best practice guidance and spoken to the landowner, because it's likely there's already management in place that you can help with. So how is it now? When you walk onto your site, what do you see when you look around, and how does the site behave seasonally? I'm saying site to be inclusive, but that could be a garden, it could be a local park, it could be a woodland, it could be any green space or even a brownfield site. How wet is it? You're thinking about these abiotic factors, these non-living factors. To an extent, you could argue that soil is living. But how wet is it? Are there areas of flood, or is there areas that are naturally really, really dry that sort of totally desert themselves in summer? How sunny is it? Is it south facing, or is it a really heavily shaded site, or is it a mix? I find it really helpful to sort of draw a little bit of a map out what your site is, so you can write down, and maybe you'd have an abiotic map, drawing out the areas with grass, the areas that might be sort of concrete hard standing, the areas where there's shrubs, and then you can also write in as a mirrored one and sort of highlight where it's really sunny and where it's really shady in those in-between areas. Another important consideration is soil conditions. So is the soil compacted? More common if you're going to be dealing with a sort of park space. Is it really clayey, or is the soil really dark and rich or sandy? Some people sort of worry that they need to get their soil formally tested, but I'd really recommend sort of going with your intuition, reading a little bit about soil characteristics. Yeah, Peter, you were shooting above the goalpost there. We're getting to it. We're getting to it. So really, either whether or not you just speak to other people that utilize that space, maybe you've got some people that are passionate gardeners that you could bring down and ask them to take a look at the soil, or just investing in a bit of a cheap pH meter from the internet. There's lots of different ways you can approximate the condition of your soil. And lastly, looking at the health of any existing features. So if there's a hedgerow, is it really thick and lush? Is it gappy? Is it really looking quite sorry for itself? That's a big sign. Is there only a couple of species? Is there a pond there? And if so, is it green or full of leaf litter? Or if there's trees, are they looking, again, quite diseased? Is there a lot of deadwood in the tree that needs to be removed? There's a lot that you can read just from walking around a space. And lastly, I've got a slide on this later. If you can identify invasive species, and really an invasive species is likely something that looks like it's really taking over, then you'll need to research the appropriate management for whatever you've got. Now, again, Google is a great resource for this, but there are also different ways you can investigate invasive species if you're not personally confident. And it's really important to research what the species is so that you know what the appropriate management is. If it's Himalayan balsam, then it can just be removed and composted. Whereas if it's Japanese knotweed, you're most likely going to need specialist removal. So yeah, just making sure you know what you're dealing with. So again, knowing your site, what are the historic species there? To find out what species are or have been there, we can do a quick historical records check for records. You can do this for free on websites like NBN Atlas, or for a fee via the local Environmental Records Centre. Now, in Bristol, we have the Bristol Regional Environmental, all of Avon, we have the Bristol Regional Environmental Records Centre. But yeah, some of the locations will be obscured if you're going on NBN Atlas, whereas if you want really accurate information, it's recommended to go to the local record centre. Again, understanding, is the site designated? Are there any priority habitats? Again, you can check this on the internet using resources like Magic Maps. And finally, who owns the site? Who are the other stakeholders? They'll need to be consulted and involved in any management taking place, and that is sort of key to the success of any work that you're doing. So once you have the answers to all of these, you're well equipped to start looking at restoring the habitats on site. So just 3 little bits now before we take a 5-minute break, or a couple of minute break. So there's 3 really key principles for managing land for wildlife. There is this first one, heterogeneity. So I've included this word just because it's a really great biological term, and everybody likes learning a new good word, a nice long chunky chewy word. Heterogeneity, it essentially means diversity, and in habitats what diversity means is you have a mosaic of conditions. So when you look at this great little diagram I've got here, you can see you've got in the top left your least diverse area. There's 2 habitats and they're sort of split into these 4 squares. When you increase the configurational diversity, you've still got 2 habitats, but they're a bit more broken up. It's a little bit easier for animals and other wildlife to move around that space. Whereas when you increase the diversity of the species present, for example, you may have 4 different species, and that's great because you can now have capacity for, twice as many species than you could before. But when you really go down to that bottom right corner, this is what we're looking at. We want a nice mix with lots of ecotones, lots of phased changes between the different habitats, because this little area is going to be totally unique compared to this little area, and this little area is completely unique to this little area. So when we talk about heterogeneity or diversity, we're thinking about variation in height of the grass, maybe, or variation in the depths of the pond, or variation in shrub size, or age of trees, or even just variation in the species present. The second key principle is slow traditional techniques. So gentle is a subjective term when we talk about habitat management. So we'll talk about some techniques like coppicing and scything in a bit. And I understand that to some people, a chainsaw or a hedge trimmer may not feel like a particularly traditional or gentle technique, but these are often necessary tools when we're managing larger trees or, bigger areas of habitat. But when you compare these to sort of that more extreme end of intensive site management, efficient site management, like tractor mounted tree removers or flail mowers, tree forders can clear tens of large trees in an afternoon, and mechanical flail mowers can cut hundreds of meters of hedge on all sides in a day too. So when we talk about gentle, slow management, we talk about those sort of pre-industrialization techniques. And lastly, the sort of final key principle that's really important to remember is following best practice guidance. So we're really lucky in the UK. We have so many respected institutions that collate and conduct the best research for their chosen areas of interest. And there's not much you can't find out with a bit of Googling. So just remembering to head to those independent charities and environmental NGOs if you want to find sort of well-translated technical information into information that's digestible. So that was quite a lot of information. I'm going to leave you guys. I've put 5 minutes. I can see that I am running a little bit over. So should we just start? Should we just say until past and then we'll come back?
Yeah, past is good. Thanks, Amy. Feel free to get a tea, have a quick wee, put questions in the chat, whatever you want to do, and then we'll start. Yeah, past or just after gives people a few minutes just to absorb that.
Great. Thanks, guys.
We'll just give it a couple more minutes, but there's already some nice questions in the chat, so thank you for putting those in there.
Great. As people come back on, I will whisk away, and what we'll do, I'll still finish with plenty of time, but if we have lots of questions, they take us over, what we can do is we can just answer them in the summary email, just so that if anybody needs to get off bang on 7, we've not sort of...
Yeah, we won't forget your question. Don't worry, even if we can't get to it tonight.
Okie dokes. Prompt start. So, just recapping, key principles, slow traditional techniques, diversity in every aspect, best practice guidance. So, the first of our habitats that I'm going to cover is hedgerows. So our hedgerows support an amazing diversity of plants and animals, providing wildlife with a rich larder throughout the year. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but there's very few native wildlife species that we can think of that don't interact with or benefit from hedgerows, native species-rich hedgerows at some point in their life cycle. And as well as providing food and shelter, hedgerows create really vital links across the countryside, helping wildlife to move freely and keep populations genetically healthy. They are also good for the landscape and the wider environment, as they help prevent soil erosion. They do a really good job of absorbing and capturing a lot of those pollutants that could run off of fields, and they assist with water regulation. And they store carbon to help combat climate change. So there's really very little that hedgerows don't do in terms of biodiversity. And the priorities for your sort of optimum hedgerow is as many native woody species as feasible. Most of the sort of common species you might find in a hedgerow include hawthorns, elders, blackthorns, hazel and dog rose. You'll also get larger sort of alders and oaks and ash. All sorts of native trees will live in hedgerows.
Amy, I think you're still on the tea break slide. I don't know if you have a hedgerow slide.
No, yeah, I do. It's not caught up, has it? Right. Thanks for letting me know. Right, what about that?
We're still on tea.
I might have to unshare and reshare. Oh, that's annoying.
Yeah. Oh, that did something.
Okay, great. I know what I have to do. Okay, great. So, sorry, that was the recap. This is my nice hedgerow page. Has that moved to the picture?
Yeah, that looks good. Yeah, thanks,
Great.
Amy.
Okay, yeah. So, as I mentioned, native woody shrubs, flowering climbers, wildflower margins. Did I get to connectivity? I'm not sure I did. Yeah, so presence of flowering climbers. So in a really nice, well-established native hedgerow, you'll have species like bryony, sort of white and black bryony, hops, honeysuckle, clematis, also weaving their ways through. And yeah, continuity and connectivity are really important features of good hedgerows. So having very few or no gaps, and having the hedgerows connecting other sort of larger habitats. And lastly, the shape of a hedgerow is really important. So a nice thick, wide base with a thinner, sort of narrower top means that you get as much light getting into that as possible. Yes. So what has that changed?
Oh, I did thumbs up. I realised you might not see it yet.
Great. Yeah. Right, we're back on track. So, however, lack of management or the wrong kind of management can lead to a real degradation in our hedgerows. So, first off, what do we know about our site? What's already living there? And are there any gaps we can fill? Other considerations are, is it a native hedge or is it non-native? Here is an example of a really poor hedge on the left and a good hedge on the right. So left isn't really fit for purpose, both agriculturally as a livestock barrier, but also as a wildlife corridor. So we can kind of tell from the picture we're either in spring, possibly even summer or autumn, and it doesn't appear to have any sort of leaf growth. There's no cover for nesting birds. There's no cover for small mammals. There's no protection from the elements. And there's these big gaps preventing any sort of flowers from developing where it's been overcut. Whereas on the right, the hedge is really beautifully thick, tall. It's really abundant with flowers that would eventually turn into different berry species to support our birds over winter. And I think, to be honest, you could probably shelter an entire family of deer in that and you wouldn't notice. So quite intuitive looking at a hedge, but just because a hedge is looking pretty sorry for itself, as this one on the left, doesn't mean that it's unfixable and unsavable. If anything, it's a good condition for doing a good bit of restoration. And I've included this app here, this sort of plug for the People's Trust for Endangered Species hedgerow survey. It's a really great citizen science survey that both contributes to their national monitoring of hedgerow conditions, but also really helps you understand and learn what features are important for a healthy hedgerow. So if you take it to your sort of local park or next time you're on a walk somewhere and give it a go, it really takes you through structure and species abundance, and various different factors. Also, something worth considering is you might have protected species residing in the hedgerow. So it's really important when you proceed with any management that you proceed really carefully. You do your due diligence with those background checks. You know, if you do some research and it says that every other, you know, there's 15 records of greater crested newts all around the field that you're working in, there's probably greater crested newts living in your hedgerow. So proceed with caution, use due diligence, and you should be all right. So managing hedgerows, there's sort of three really key approaches. Firstly, I've mentioned conservation grazing. The natural grazing patterns of animals, if you have sort of cows or goats or horses even, they do make excellent hedge managers. But of course, this means you do have to be a livestock owner. So this is really for your sort of larger estate level land management. And you will end up with a much wilder result. They don't have much of an eye for detail, but it is the best option for large land holdings. And you can see some really great examples of conservation grazing at Folly Farm or down at Belmont Estate. Coppicing is also a really great one that I'll expand on more later. So coppicing involves cutting the certain trees down to the base, known as a stool. You sort of cut them on an angle and on a rotational basis, which allows the trees to regenerate through straight new growth. And coppicing is another really beautiful ancient method that's really famous for sort of hazel and willow coppicing, but also extends to lime trees, hawthorn, maple. And when you cut that tree back, the regeneration can actually extend the life of the tree. And lastly, we've got our mechanical means, so either through hedge cutters or flail mowing. So hedge cutters are pretty low impact. They get the job done quickly. They're best for like bigger spaces where if you can afford to do it by hand, it's great. If you have to use a hedge trimmer, not a problem. But flail mowing is sort of the least desirable management when you're considering wildlife, simply because they're quite indiscriminate in what they cut and they're very intrusive. They can sometimes result in jagged cuts to the wood, which I think makes older trees a bit more susceptible to disease. And they cut at the same height, which can result in sort of structural changes. But when managing hedges at scale, flails can often be the only economical option for many landowners, and you can mitigate the negative impacts of flail mowing by cutting much less regularly on a sort of 3-year rotation, and also cutting at varied heights each year. So coppicing, in case anybody on the call is unfamiliar with coppicing, I've just done a really quick breakdown with my animated tree on the left because it's surprisingly hard to find semi-mature trees, standalone trees on the internet. So coppicing involves cutting a tree stem to the stump as close to the ground as possible, as you can see in the second photo, at a very slight angle. This stops sort of water pooling on the top and rotting it. And you can repeat this anytime between sort of 5 to 20 years, depending on the species and what you want the wood for. And really, you want to do this in a woodland in a checkerboard effect, so ensuring you're rotating where you're cutting so that each part of the woodland is in regeneration at different times and you're ensuring minimal disturbance. It's best done in sort of late autumn or winter before buds burst and birds are nesting. Really, it should be between 0.25 and 1 hectare. Any smaller than the coppice will probably not grow particularly well because it'll be shaded out. There's certain species like oak and beech which are very slow growing, so they tend to be left as standing timber. And coppicing should also avoid any sort of veteran or ancient trees. It's really important to sort of leave them alone because they are more valuable to wildlife in their current state than they would be coppiced. And then I've also got improving hedgerows, so filling in gaps with more native woody species, is one option, and swapping out non-native monoculture hedges, so those sort of thick Leylandii hedges, or beech hedges are great as a native tree. They support a lot of wildlife through their annual regrowth. Cherry laurel as well can become a little bit invasive. So opting for native species-rich options is ideal. And then also adding those flowering climbers that we talked about. And then also I've included a really beautiful picture of hedge laying. Now, I am a massive fan of a laid hedge. It's a technique that involves partially cutting the taller stems and shrubs, laying them on their side, but retaining connection to the base of the growth. And then they're all woven together with hazel or willow poles. It varies massively regionally based on where you are, how these look. But yeah, it creates a really beautiful thick lattice, which then goes on to sprout upwards. So it really reinforces the physical structure, makes it a lot less permeable, and makes it a lot more attractive to wildlife. And I've done a little plug there because in February, we have an introduction to hedge laying day at Grow Wilder. So if you're interested in doing any, I'm going to be there. Come along to Grow Wilder and join us on the hedge laying day. It is a ticketed paid event, but it'll be well worth it. Next up, sort of the second of the three key habitats we're talking about is managing meadows. So I'm not going to go particularly deep into meadows as I just did with hedgerows, just because I'm running a talk next week on that. So if you're really interested in deep diving meadows, come to that. But I'll just go over the really main considerations for managing any grassland. So yeah, imagine if you don't already have a wildflower patch or a meadow, imagine you do. So when you're managing or improving a grassland, it's really important to understand the soil type that you're working with. Soil pH and texture generally defines the plant community, as well as rainfall and sunlight as secondary influences. You can check the pH soil, as I mentioned before, with electronic meters you can get online, but really becoming familiar with the texture of the soil in your hand is really useful. And there's actually papers that evidence that people's intuition with soil can be relatively accurate to what they're dealing with. Another consideration is nutrient availability, which is tied to the soil structure or soil condition. I've got this sort of triangular diagram here on the screen, which shows your sort of four key components. You've got clay, silt and sand, and then loam, which is a bit of a mix of all of them, but does make up its own sort of element. And as any soil becomes higher or lower in a percentage of any of these, this is going to affect the properties of the soil, of how acidic it is, or its ability to retain water and nutrients. So yeah, picking some sand up, some soil up, speaking to local people that maybe are keen gardeners is going to be really, really helpful to understanding what you're dealing with. So the number one way to manage your meadow is through scything. Scything is brilliant. We've got a nice picture here from one of our wildlife champion event days where we went out to Pill Paddock, Sue's local spot, and did a load of scything on an old paddock there. And on the left, you can see a wasp spider that we were lucky enough to encounter. So that really highlights to me my key point, that scythes really allow critters to escape the blade in time, which is something that push along mowers or ride on mowers really doesn't allow you to do. And it allows you to investigate other ecological signs that you may uncover as you cut, things that you would otherwise miss. This could be sort of nests of small mammals or amphibians, solitary bee nests, interesting invertebrates, or you might even come across, hoglets or baby deer. I know two people that have come across those. So I'm not being sort of, what's the word? Fantasizing about it. It does happen. People come across baby deer. But bear in mind, you want to cut when the plants have started to set seed but are still standing tall. So you want to choose sort of a late summer, early autumn morning when the grass is dewy, but not after a soaking wet shower, because then the grass gets really heavy and it all leans over. Another point with sort of scything is generally the early cut, known as a hay cut, will suffice to keep a meadow happy. But if you're really enjoying scything, or if you feel that your meadow needs it, then spring or winter cuts can be beneficial too. And then also I've included raking here. If you don't have a meadow or a grassland that's already in reasonable condition, and you've got a lawn that you want to start making more biodiverse, just raking it really aggressively in the autumn is a really good way of creating a lot more bare soil. It allows seeds to access the soil better, damages the thatch and the ryegrasses. Damages the thatches that the ryegrasses create. And this is a really good way of, a slower way, albeit, but a really good way of converting those sort of ryegrass turf lawns into a lot more of a diverse lawn over time. Because once you've raked it really aggressively, exposed all that bare soil, you can plant. Sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. You can plant meadowmaker species like yellow rattle or red bartsia, which we sell at Grow Wilder as seed packets, which is a really good way of, sort of establishing a better diversity over time. Lastly, I have included harrowing there, just because when you're looking at those much larger areas that are more maybe more well used or previously agricultural, harrowing is a really good way of breaking up soil to improve the structure and the aeration, to create more pockets for seed setting. It also can create a blank slate if you just want to start afresh and see what seed bank is already in the soil. And like I said, much better for those really large sites. Last point on meadows is timing is really important. So I mentioned before, unlike the other two sort of woodier areas where you're looking at nesting bird season, where you don't want to be disturbing mammals and birds, with meadows, really you want to be doing your management in the summer. So 2 to 3 cuts a year, max. One in spring, which can suffice. One in summer, which can suffice. Maybe an extra one in spring or autumn as well. And it's very dependent on the state of the meadow and what stage it's at. So it can change based on the weather each year. And always wait for the flowers to set seed before the final cut. And I guess it wouldn't be a meadow management talk if I didn't mention, always remove your cuttings. Any arisings that you remove, that you cut from the site, take them off of the site, because that's a way of removing the nutrients that are on the soil and, in creating a better environment of low nutrients for meadow species. So, managing woodlands. This is the last sort of main habitat I'm going to touch on, and then we'll wrap up. Woodland habitats in the UK are varied and unique, and they range from sort of ancient woodlands in the south to native pine woods in the north. And since the last ice age, our woodlands have really reduced. And as I mentioned before, sort of death knell was that sort of, post-medieval period where we really deforested our landscape heavily. Anyone who owns a patch of woodland or manages a patch of woodland can help make it as diverse as possible. And much of the wildlife within our woodlands relies on active management to provide a mix of different habitats, which we'll touch on too. So often this management work mimics natural processes like storm damage or wind damage or grazing by large animals, by species that would have once lived in our woodlands for a long time. So without some form of management, most of our woodlands become quite dark and overshaded. And ultimately, this reduces the amount of wildlife that can live in them. So these sorts of key good woodland features we'll go over now. Again, I've mentioned coppicing before. So coppicing woodlands, really great way, not just hedgerows, but a great way of increasing the amount of sunlight reaching the forest floor. Really good way of creating glades and rides, which I'll touch on, which are heavily used by bats and butterflies, a lot more of those delicate species. And also you can employ a technique called scalloping, which these diagrams show really well. These two diagrams from the Royal Forestry Society and New Forest Guide show how scalloping the edge of woodland along a ride creates sort of an area where there's much less wind, and it'll heat up more. It'll be warmer. Maybe you'll have a bit of a ecotone from tall woodland through shrub into grassland. And then this diagram, sort of the similar sort of thing, but showing how these pinch points, you can sort of maintain more vegetation in these pinch points so that wildlife can move through these gaps. But this scalloped edge means that any wildlife that may be hiding here or nesting here is a little bit safer from any predators that may be moving through the space in other areas. So rides and scalloped edges are really important ways that we can increase the value of woodlands for wildlife. And then also retaining deadwood. Deadwood is a really important component of a healthy woodland, and I often visit woodlands that are quite over-tidied by land managers. Both standing and fallen deadwood have different benefits, and the only real reason I feel to completely fell and remove trees would really be for safety or disease control or woodland rehabilitation, where maybe you have a very densely planted plantation and you're thinning it out. Standing deadwood offers great bat roosting and bird nesting opportunities, perches for raptors, and hibernation cavities for small mammals like dormice and squirrels. And fallen deadwood is more likely to become a bit more water saturated, which will support fungi and mosses and lichens, where you'll more often find amphibians hunting for sort of beetles and slugs. It's a really beautiful diagram here. I wish we could sort of spend a bit more time looking at it. I've included one slide here about managing water bodies. I'm not going to go into the same level of detail just because, again, they're a bit of a can of worms, and this is a land management webinar. But I'd really recommend, if you're interested in managing water bodies and you've not been to one of our sort of pond workshops, if you head over to the Freshwater Habitats Trust or to BART. Freshwater habitats more for ponds and BART more for like streams and rivers. But sort of key components of managing water bodies is ensuring that you have native marginal vegetation. As I'm sure many people are aware, we have a massive issue in Avon with non-native species on our riverbanks. And like I said before, depending on what the species is, identify it well first because they have different management needs. Having some woody debris in rivers is also really important. Sometimes people can feel like a river is being degraded if there's a lot of like fallen logs or maybe a log jam somewhere after a storm. But actually, these woody debris habitats are really, really valuable in flowing freshwater habitats. There's even entire groups of invertebrates that require log jams to be able to reproduce. And it acts almost as a bit of a physical filter. So whenever you do have those storms, it's often the log jam that acts almost like a mini beaver dam to slow the flow, collect leaf litter and other debris. Graduated banks on a freshwater habitat, whether it be a stream or a pond, having a rocky substrate is mostly preferred as it creates more microhabitats again for those invertebrates, those aquatic invertebrates. And also clear water. I mean, occasional cloudiness is to be expected, especially after rain, and occasional algal blooms, especially in ponds. But really, you're aiming for clear water most of the time. And just one last point about low nutrient levels. It's a really complicated issue to tackle in rivers. So that's why we've kind of left this one out. But in ponds, low nutrient level, you want low nutrients, so you can mitigate this by adding vegetation that does a really good job of absorbing a lot of those additional nutrients. So in summary, the key takeaways that I ultimately want to push here is that diversity is really key. Diversity in your species, in your habitats, and your ages of those things. Using gentle, phased management wherever possible, and opting for the least impactful option when managing a space. Because nature is in no rush, and you give wildlife a chance to respond to change in the environment when you do things slowly, as traditional techniques afford us. And lastly, really, if in doubt, just Google it out. There's a wealth of resources online and so many organisations that translate that wildlife research into accessible guides and resources. And take inspiration from the best examples of our natural world. Head to SSSIs, head to nature reserves, head to national parks, go and look at examples of where these habitats are more in symbiosis, where there's good diversity, and you'll see good examples of those ecotomes. Thank you for that. I feel like for me that was really fast, but you guys have been sat here for almost an hour, so I really appreciate your patience. I've got some further resources here that I will put out in the summary email to all the recipients of this talk. But shall we head over to you, Emma? I'll stop sharing because I can't see anybody then.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Amy. That was brilliant. Real whistle-stop tour of all those key principles. Hopefully that was helpful to everyone. We have some great questions in the chat. We might not have time for them all because we're in the last 10 minutes, but I will try my best to get through as many as we can. So, interesting question. Charlie asked, can non-native plant species still be useful/beneficial to native wildlife?
Yeah, absolutely. So the with non-native species, you run into the risk of, really newly introduced species. We don't know how they interact with our habitats. That's where most of our invasive species come from, right? Is that they're non-native species we've introduced ornamentally, and then we've got, oh crap, that's not doing good things. With non-native species, a lot of really established non-native species that we use ornamentally in gardens are not malignant. I can't remember the percentage, but it's actually a very, very small percentage of non-native plants that are invasive. And I am very much of the view that if it's not doing harm and it fulfills a gap in your ecosystem, i.e., Bristol has got so many beautiful magnolia trees. They're non-native, but they're not coming at the cost of any other native wildlife, and they're a huge benefit as one of our earliest pollinator opportunities. So, a good resource to look at for malignant species is the Non-Native Species Secretariat. They do bulletins and updates of new emerging invasive species, but generally, if it's not listed on there, it's absolutely fine to be used. But definitely look at the behavior of the plant, because just because something isn't listed doesn't mean it wouldn't also be a bit of a thug in your environment. And I'm definitely not anti non-natives, but I do agree that native plants have evolved with our native wildlife for millennia. So it's always the best option to go native first.
Brilliant, thank you. And we have a question about meadow management. So Charlotte said that with meadow management, they had a lot of grass last year that outgrew a lot of the wildflowers. And would a summer cut have reduced this?
Yes. So if you've got a lot of ryegrass, is probably what you had. So healthy meadows, first of all, do have grasses. They just don't have competitive turf grasses. That's an important thing to remember. Really, in the wild, you'll never find a healthy wildflower meadow with no grass. But it's about having a diversity of gentle grasses rather than these really competitive. The most common grass that we have in turfs is perennial ryegrass. And I can imagine if it's a sort of domestic lawn or garden, then you've probably got perennial ryegrass. So what you're going to want to do is, best case scenario, you actually strip the turf, cut it up, roll the mats up, chuck it somewhere where it can compost down, and then start with totally bare soil again, and then seed that up and seed it with a wildflower mix that will be, maybe 70% gentle grasses, 30% wildflowers, maybe 100% wildflower mix if you want to go all out. Or you could go a slower, less sort of intensive total change, and you can cut your turf grass right down as low as it will go, get the rake out, rake the living daylights out of it, and then seed with a mix that specifically has those meadow maker species we were talking about: yellow rattle, red bartsia. Grow Wilder does a combo seed mix if you're looking. It might be a little bit late to be seeding them now, but you'll have to talk to Sean. You'll have to go to Grow Wilder and have a chat to him about that. But yeah, getting those meadow maker species in, they are parasitic species that feed off of the root systems of competitive grasses. So they do a really good job of loosening that sort of chokehold that ryegrass has on a lawn, and providing a lot more of space for wildflowers.
Yeah, brilliant. And also, I guess we might touch on that a little bit more. Our session next week is delving more into wildflower meadows and the creation of that. So if you're able to come along to that one, there'll be more information then.
Absolutely.
We have a question from Emma about hedges, asking why so many public hedges are cut in the winter.
So hedges need to be cut. Fundamentally, if they're not cut, so maybe I wasn't clear enough about the cutting that we do of hedges is essentially replicating the chomping of wild and then domestic livestock that historically has looked after our shrubs. That's what we use in hedgerows, native hedgerows. The tree species are mostly shrubby trees. So we have to cut our hedgerows, otherwise they get really leggy and they turn into whole trees, where then they have a different function. So we cut in winter because we are no longer in the nesting bird season, and also because other more other species that may be reliant on hedgerows will be ground nesting at that time. So it's the safest time for wildlife to cut. We would like to see hedgerows being cut on a less regular basis, where maybe every year only one side of the hedges is cut. I know that the Bristol Council Nature Conservation Team is looking at all different ways that the council can adapt their management to become more wildlife focused. So that may be something they're planning to do, or maybe even do in certain places. But yeah, the best way to manage hedgerows is to cut them on a 3-year rotation, which means that just every year you cut a different side, which means that every year, every side has 2 years to regenerate, which creates the best growth for blossom to grow. It only grows on like 2-year-old growth. Does that answer the question? I hope so.
No, I think that's brilliant, Amy. And yeah, we can always expand on this in a follow-up email as well. This might be the last time for the last question, but we'll see if we can get through any more. So there's another question about hedge laying. So with hedge laying, where you cut part way through the base, do you know what I mean when I say that, Amy?
Yes, yeah.
Can that, Sue's asking if that can be done to any species in the hedge or just specific ones?
Yeah, generally, if it's a hedge, it will respond well. We're talking about native hedges here. If it's in a hedge, then it's a species that responds well to cutting and can be lain. So, hawthorn, blackthorn, buckthorn, hazel, willow, maple, alder, even. Yeah, all of these different species respond really well. You can lay the hedge, great. If you have a artificially planted hedge, well, that's not very helpful. If you have a hedge that's maybe, beech also coppices really well. It's just a very much slower growth. Sorry, beech lays well, but it's a lot slower growing. It's a lot more knobbly. It doesn't have that same straight growth. If you were to say have a species that doesn't respond well, which you probably wouldn't come across silver birch as a hedge, but other trees that you don't typically find in hedges, they're not going to lay as a hedge because fundamentally they're not used as hedging because they don't respond well to cutting, if that makes sense. Fab.
Yeah,
Well, I reckon we
brilliant.
got time for one more.
One
People
more, okay. Let's pick one more. Okay, I'm going to go with Peter, who asked a question about a wall. So he says, I have a long sunny wall, 10 feet high, next to what I hope will be a meadow. What sort of things can someone do to use and cover a wall?
Luckily, I know Peter's wall because Peter is one of our TWIAS service users. So great question, Peter. In your case, the wall is, I believe, quite like south facing. So it's great for getting a trellis up and getting some climbers up. You could do a mix of different clematis, and honeysuckle are always sort of the ones that we really recommend because they are really attractive to a lot of the pollinators that feed bats. On those sort of sunnier walls, you could also look at non-native varieties that would do well, that I would recommend putting in pots. So passion flower and jasmine, star jasmine. You don't really want to plant them in the ground because they can be quite vigorous. So planting them in pots, but allowing them to climb. Again, night scented, they're going to be really attractive to those evening pollinators, which means that that wall is going to go from a static feature to a living feature. And if you have the patience, also establishing an ivy vine. Ivy takes about 8 to 10 years to fully mature. So you've got to be patient and you'll have to stop it creeping in other places. But ivy facing the sun, when it's matured to be able to flower and fruit, is one of the best pollen sources later in the summer for bees, wasps, hornets, hoverflies, you name it. If it's flying and makes some sort of nectar-based delicious dessert condiment, breakfast condiment, it's going to be using ivy. So yeah, ivy is another great one. And the beauty of climbers is you can have a mix. You know, you can plant them at different points along the wall and they can sort of merge into each other. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amy. I think that was a really nice one to end on as well, because we often don't think of something like walls as a habitat, but they're so important, and a lot of people will have them in their gardens or even a balcony or something like that. So that's a nice way to wrap up, I think.
Yeah, with a wall, you need to trellis it. So make sure you get permission from whoever owns the wall if you're going to be putting a trellis sort of drilled into it. But any railing or chain link fence is already trellised. So whack some climbers in there, do a bit of guerrilla climber planting. I didn't say that. That's the thoughts of Amy Cook and not the wildlife. But really, yeah, looking at things as opportunities and what structures provide us. And yeah, a south facing wall should not be an opportunity missed.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy. We haven't quite got to all the questions, but don't worry, we will answer them in the follow-up email. We don't want to keep you too long. But just a huge thank you for being here tonight. We will send out the recording and resources. And we're not quite done with us yet. There's 3 more sessions that you can come to if you like. Next week, we've got wildflower meadow creation. Then we've got our in-person day at Grow Wilder. There's still spaces on that. And then we'll wrap up with an intro to monitoring and recording, which is another online session. So I'll send all those links out in the follow-up email if you wanted to sign up. But yeah, thank you so much. Feel free to log off. Have a lovely evening.